From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South. I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. Interpol has issued a red notice against the leader of Colombia's National Liberation Army. The judiciary in Colombia has filed charges against Nicolás Rodríguez Bautista, alias Gabino, for aggravated homicide and criminal recruitment. Some fear this will put the peace dialogue with the armed group at risk. Meanwhile, FARC member Iván Márquez says modifications made to the 2016 peace agreement are a betrayal. He believes the group was naive to lay down its weapons before the deal was implemented. On their part, Colombian authorities have accused him and another member of not being committed with peace.
Also today, Iván Márquez and Oscar Montero have given a first statement on wanting to continue with the process. It's very important that they respond to the judge.
Our correspondent in Bogotá, José Manuel Jiménez, has more on the issue.
The contents of the letter from Iván Márquez and Oscar Montero were made public in Colombia on Tuesday. However, the controversial move was criticized by politicians who say the document should instead have been sent to the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. It all began on September 17th when the Peace Commission wrote the two former FARC fighters, whose whereabouts are unknown. The Commission asked them if they intended to continue the peace process. Márquez and Montero wrote back to the Commission. The FARC party has said it agrees with concerns outlined by Márquez and Montero about great difficulty in implementing peace agreements. The United Nations has called for its implementation and for an end to paramilitarism. That request has fallen on deaf ears. Instead, armed groups continue to murder social leaders across regions. They also say there's a serious problem with the delivery of justice. Case in point, the Jesus Santrich case. We still don't know whether or not he will be extradited. Months ago, public prosecutors announced that they are in possession of evidence in the form of audio recordings of persons allegedly involved in drug trafficking. However, just a few days ago, the very same public prosecutor said it is in fact the U.S. government which is in possession of that evidence and not them. Meanwhile, Márquez is attempting to discredit this evidence. The FARC has told Iván Márquez to join the party and to follow the political path they signed in order to find solutions.
Peru's former president Alberto Fujimori has been taken to a local hospital. This after the Supreme Court overturned his pardon and ordered his arrest. He will be returned to prison where he was serving a 25-year sentence for human rights abuses. The court found grounds to uphold a civil appeal against the pardon granted last December by then-President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. Fujimori's pardon and release led to widespread protests, and Kuczynski was forced to resign 2 months later. Fujimori's supporters have clashed with police officials outside the former president's residence. They reportedly shout at and push officers who arrived to execute a search of the house. Meanwhile, Fujimori's daughter Keiko says she will appeal the court's decision. She believes her father has the right to be pardoned.
Today is one of the saddest days of our lives. It is extremely painful to know a judge from our country has taken away my father's freedom, saying that because he is not dying, he has no right to a humanitarian pardon.
Fujimori's lawyers say the appeal will be based on the health condition of the former president, but activists say this is just an excuse for Fujimori to get away with his crimes.
In the morning when I spoke to him, he was quite shocked, and this, as you know, for someone who has a heart illness, can have an immediate effect.
The Peruvian government, on its part, say it respects the court decision. In a public statement, the government says the judiciary has the independence to take its decisions. Chile's Archbishop appeared at the prosecutor's office accused of covering up sex abuse by members of the clergy. Cardinal Ricardo Esati exercised his right to remain silent. He faces charges of concealing the sexual abuse and rape of at least 7 children by priest Oscar Muñoz, who was arrested in July of this year. The judiciary is currently investigating 119 sexual abuse cases and an alleged pedophile network in the Chilean church.
The truth is, the right to remain silent is expressly established within our penal processing code for all those accused of crimes. Additionally, it's true that our legislation establishes a very important aspect, which is that to exercise that right does not bring about any negative consequences.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Back. With 4 days to go until Brazil's general elections, the candidates are making their final bid for votes. A series of recent polls commissioned by the mainstream media show the Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad firmly in second place at around 21%. That puts him ahead of any rivals from the center-left and the center-right. But polls also suggest that far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro has extended his lead in first place with around 31%. On Tuesday, Haddad warned that the Brazilian elite is trying to bring back the far right. We're joined now by Mike Fox to talk more about what's going on in Brazil. He's an independent journalist following the electoral campaign in Brazil. Hi Mike, thank you for joining us. How's the atmosphere in Brazil? Are you feeling the polarization on the streets?
You can feel the polarization pretty well. The atmosphere is fairly intense. I'd say it's energized because people are really excited one way or another. You know, those supporters for Haddad, the possibility of a return to the left, and also obviously those supporters for Bolsonaro that are really excited about a drastic change for Brazil. There is a very large percent of the population there in the middle that isn't quite sure what to believe. I was interviewing people on the street just this afternoon, and there's a lot of people that are split, but definitely people, I'd say they're nervous, they're energized, and they're looking forward towards Sunday for whatever that's going to mean.
This is one of the most controversial elections in Brazil's history, with Lula's ban and Bolsonaro's stabbing. How do you think this could affect the final outcome?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's hard to say because everything mixes together. It's hard to say exactly what and draw out one conclusion or the other. Obviously, we know that Lula's been banned, so had he been able to run, it was very likely he was going to maybe not win in the first round, but definitely make it to the second round. I've interviewed people in the last few weeks that have definitely said they would vote for Lula, but they were kind of on the cuff about whether or not they were going to vote for Haddad. At the same time, I've met a lot of people. I was in an Haddad rally just 2 weeks ago, and people were extremely excited about Haddad's candidacy and very clear that Haddad is Lula, Lula is Haddad. And really, that's Haddad's, that has been his push that he's been reiterating ever since, his campaign started. He became the candidate for the Workers' Party, and he understands that that is really what's going to get him into the presidency, is being able to make this connection between Lula and himself. And this is what was felt. I was in Bahia, one of the states in the Northeast, just a few days ago, and this is really what a lot of people felt, and he had a lot of support up there. Obviously, Bolsonaro stabbing, that was huge, and it's been huge. He has not been able to. He was in the hospital for weeks and weeks. He's now home in Sao Paulo, but he hasn't been at any campaigns. He hasn't been able to speak in public, and that's meant he hasn't been able to get out there and really kind of push, show himself, get his rival up, his supporters, which has always been the big thing. Every time he goes to a different airport, he's got hundreds or thousands of supporters there to lift him up in the air and carry him, and he hasn't been able to do that in almost a month. And so, in some ways, the sympathy vote, I feel like has really kind of helped to lift him, but also it's meant that he hasn't been able to get out there to really kind of spur on the support that many people were hoping for. His sons have been continuing to do that, and obviously he has supporters around the country that have been continuing to mobilize, but a lot of analysts say that has hurt him in some ways, even though he's just, in the last couple of days, like you said, he's been climbing in the polls just recently.
Now let's talk more about the Workers' Party. Are Lula supporters going to come out and vote for Haddad?
Well, that is the question, and that question itself will define what the first round and what the second round look like. It's pretty clear that, at least at this point, that Haddad and that Bolsonaro are going to make it into the second round, both of them. If Lula supporters turn out en masse, it'll mean that Haddad has a much higher percentage. And I think that's really, that's been what he's been pushing for. It's been what he's been hoping for, and really that has been his line ever since he became the presidential candidate. Is that I am Lula, Lula is me. In fact, there's been propaganda shorts that have been kind of passed around on WhatsApp with people dancing Lula, Adaji, Lula. And so part of this is all to kind of get people feeling that Adaji represents Lula, and more so than he represents the Workers' Party, but he represents Lula. He is Lula's representation, or he will be Lula's representative in government. And this is important just so that people understand, Lula left office in 2010 with an 87% approval rating. He lifted millions out of poverty, and people really, really supported him. They really backed this government. Of course, it happened during a time of very high commodity prices, kind of, a very high GDP and GDP growth, and Brazil was on the up and up. But regardless, people still feel that Lula is the man to go to. Times are difficult, and that's why Adaji's connecting to Lula, and Lula's popularity isn't even higher. And of course, it was tainted by all of this kind of propaganda, and obviously the Workers' Party connections to corruption. And that's been really slammed home recently by the Bolsonaro campaign, also kind of the right really trying to taint the Workers' Party and really take down Haddad as much as possible by making these connections to corruption and to so many other issues.
Now let's talk a little more about the other candidate, Jair Bolsonaro. What has led to the rise of the far right in Brazil? How did we get here, Mike?
Well, obviously, you have to look back at the last 5 years. 2013, there was this massive push, protests that then led to Dilma's impeachment 3 years later. It's been a slow rise. The growth of the evangelical movement has been huge, now 25% of the population. And in general, it's a very conservative movement with so-called family values, anti-LGBT, anti-abortion. And so it's the same cultural issues that you see in the United States. But more recently, Jair Bolsonaro has said he's going to rule with an iron fist. He wants to wipe the slate clean. He wants to flip things on its head. He's talked about draining the swamp, the Brazilian version of draining the swamp, very, very Trump-like language. And of course, he's talking about getting rid of the insecurity. That's been his big thing that he's been slamming home. He wants to arm people. He wants to put guns into good people's hands. And so this is kind of an allegory, a theme to kind of Donald Trump's the bad guys of Mexico. And so a lot of these things are very similar that we've been talking about. Also, a big thing that people are talking about is corruption. And this is something that people continue to bring up and again, because corruption is still endemic within Brazilian society. Despite the Petrobras and the car wash scandal, whatever else, you still have 2/3 of Congress, roughly, that voted for Dilma Rousseff's impeachment are themselves under investigation for corruption or crimes. And so he says he's going to come in, he's going to wipe corruption away, and people believe, they're really excited about his kind of no holds barred and his non-PC language. They really think he can come in and do this. And so you have these two diametrically opposed kind of ideologies for the country. One of them is extreme far right, Donald Trump style, but even more so because Jair Bolsonaro comes from the military. He was a captain in the military under the dictatorship. And so that's Jair Bolsonaro. The other one is kind of return to the left, the pink tide, poverty alleviation programs, and they're trying to decide on the future of Brazil. And in the middle, you have a lot of people that at this point are really just trying to figure out where they're going from here.
Right. Now, how about the massive movement, particularly of women and the LGBTI community against Bolsonaro, in these terms of how's this going to affect the polls?
Well, obviously that was huge. The marches last Saturday were huge. Hundreds of thousands of women around the country in major cities marching not for him, and that's because of his misogynistic and racist and homophobic language. We're talking about Jair Bolsonaro's language. And so the women, they really kind of stepped it up and took to the streets. Now, it's really hard to say how this is actually going to affect things in Election Day. I think it is important to look at, we just saw some of the latest polls today, and some of these polls were taken just after the Saturday marches, and it actually showed a bump for Jair Bolsonaro. It's still at this point hard to say exactly what that came from, but that day on Saturday, you had the same time that members of Jair Bolsonaro and supporters of Jair Bolsonaro were really pushing memes linked to saying that, for instance, the PT was going to, that at age 5, children had to be handed over to, if the PT won, handed over to the government, and they were going to decide their sex. Or pushing memes, kind of homophobic memes, or showing women marching, feminist marching, but saying things disparaging against family values and whatnot. So these memes, they weren't even from the marches, but they were used to try and taint what the marches were all about. It's also important to point out that those marches, although they were widespread in many of the mainstream television and newspaper, the local media, they were not covered that much. There were also pro-Bolsonaro marches happen at the same time, which were covered. And so this kind of muddled exactly what the themes were. But it's also important to remember that these cultural issues in Brazil are really huge. This idea of family values, this idea of feminism, and also this idea of going back to what the right has called the kitschy gay. The right is very afraid of the left coming to power and then trying to inculcate ideas or gender ideas with young kids, and they believe that they're going to try and transform young kids into little gay and lesbian kids, which is a warped mindset. But this is the reality of what a lot of people here in Brazil are feeling. And so you have to understand how that fits within the larger context of this current election, why these cultural themes and these cultural ideas are really important. So that was happening a long time alongside what these women's marches were happening at the same time. And that's why this is an important issue to understand, that these memes are being pushed out across WhatsApp. In fact, Telesur published an article today I even saw, and that Haddad brought up today. He held a press conference this morning that we went to, and in that press conference he was talking about the large numbers of misinformed or fake news, so-called fake news. The Haddad camp has set up a telephone number, a WhatsApp number for people to denounce messages that are fake news, and they received 5,000 messages within a period of 12 hours. So this is about the number of kind of misinformed and misrepresented news that's being pushed and spurred, particularly across social media, but particularly on WhatsApp. And that's because WhatsApp it's not open to public, right? It's over groups, it's over individuals. It's very easy to share things, but it's also very, very difficult to regulate. And so this is something that's happening right now that I think people need to keep an eye on. It's going to continue to happen. I wrote an article about it several months ago, looking at what could happen in kind of the lead up to the elections and what's happened in the past. And it's going to remain a very important kind of organizing tool, but also an important tool for the spread of fake and misinformed information.
Really quick, Mike, are we going to see a second round?
Yeah, there's almost no doubt that we're going to see a second round. At this point, Bolsonaro is around 32% in the polls, and Haddad is about 10 points back from him. And then the next candidate after him is Ciro Gomes from the Democratic Labor Party, and he has 10 points. So the leading candidate would have to have over 50% of the valid votes in the election in order to win in the first round. And at this point, it doesn't look like any of the candidates are going to get that. Obviously, Bolsonaro will likely win the first round, and if things go kind of according to plan, unless there are big changes, then Haddad will most likely come in second. And that's what we're going to see in the second round, most likely.
It will be a nail-biting election ahead, Mike, that's for sure. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. Chile's President Sebastián Piñera looks to move past the sea access dispute with Bolivia. He said there is much to life than Bolivia. After meeting with former authorities and lawyers from the sea access case, Piñera says it is time to turn the page and look to the future. The International Court of Justice ruled on Monday that landlocked Bolivia cannot force Chile to negotiate over granting its sovereignty access to the Pacific Ocean.
We've spoken about what our country's relationship with Latin America should be, what it should be with the United States, with Pacific Asia, with Europe, and policies for the future, because a country like ours that is so integrated with the world must have international policies and a strategy that anticipates the future.
But Bolivian President Evo Morales has warned that the decisions have serious contradictions.
After his return from The Hague in the Netherlands, where he faced a ruling by the International Court of Justice that was favorable to Chile on the maritime case, President Evo Morales warned this was a contradiction.
I want to say to the International Court of Justice that this hurts our people a lot. The International Court of Justice is supposed to stand for the people, so I have decided to personally send a letter demonstrating their contradictions.
During a press conference, Morales spoke about several contradictions in the ruling. For example, the court accepted that Bolivia was founded with over 400 kilometers of coast in the Pacific Ocean, and that bilateral treaties and commitments did not solve the conflict. And yet, the court was not able to provide a favorable solution.
11 times the Organization of American States has resolved that there should be negotiations for sea access, for a corridor with sovereignty without territorial compensation. So an international court of justice that does not listen to an entire group of people, what kind of court is it?
The president reaffirmed that Bolivia will not quit on their goal of recovering sovereign access to the Pacific Ocean.
Everyone born after 1879 have continued to think about the sea, because Chile unjustly, with violence, via an undeclared war, invaded us, and it's not possible that the court benefits the invaders, the transnationals. At the end, this is what happened. I feel that it is a court for the peoples and not for the transnationals that take territories to exploit natural resources.
After 5 years of litigation, the International Court of Justice rejected the Bolivian petition that Chile must negotiate access to the sea for them. In 1879, Chile annexed the 120,000 square kilometers of territory that connected Bolivia with the Pacific Ocean.
We'll take a short break now. Don't go away. Welcome back. A Palestinian teenager has been killed in Gaza during a protest in the border with Israel. The young boy died when a tear gas canister fired by Israeli troops hit him in the head. 24 people were wounded near the border fence of Gaza Strip. At least 193 Palestinians have been killed since March, when the protests began. Canada has relaunched talks with indigenous tribes regarding the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the Pacific. The government was forced to dialogue with the communities after a court ruled that the indigenous groups get a say in the project. Authorities promised to listen to their concerns. The pipeline is aimed at moving nearly 900,000 barrels of oil a day from Alberta province to the Pacific coast. Canadian scientist Donna Strickland is the first female to win the Physics Nobel Prize since 1963. Dr. Strickland has been awarded for the development of a new technique to create short, intense laser pulses. She says women have come a long way in science, but still, steps need to be taken for female scientists to be recognized and fulfill their careers.
4:58 a.m.
The ancient city of Sabratha in Libya has been classified as an endangered site by UNESCO. Shell casings and bullets still litter the surroundings, a year after clashes between rival armed groups. Locals say snipers positioned themselves at the top of the amphitheater, once a jewel of the Roman Empire. UNESCO declared Sabratha to be at a risk along with 4 other Libyan cities on its World Heritage list. Now we come to the end of this news brief. These and many other stories you can find at our website at telesurtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. Thank you for watching.
We are always there tracking the news.